Yeah, first let me thank the organizers for putting me on the program. It's a great conference. I've learned a lot so far. I'm very happy to be here. This is a new project, well, not so new anymore, but it used to be new with Luca for now, and it's called Monetary Policy in the Age of Automation. So let me start straight with the question that we ask in the paper. What are the implications of automation for monetary policy? Now, to set the stage, let me remind you what we mean by automation. So automation is a form of technological innovation which implies that labor is replaced by capital in the execution of some productive tasks. So automation is inherently a labor saving or labor displacing rather than a labor augmenting change in the production technology. And as the literature on automation argues, technological progress in fact quite often takes the form of automation rather than this labor augmenting form that we typically have in our models. Now, why are we connecting automation with monetary policy? There are mainly two reasons for that. The first reason is that at the high level, it is commonly thought that the investment channel is an important transmission channel of monetary policy. So if investment is taking a labor saving rather than a labor augmenting form, this is bound to have important implications for the transmission for the investment channel of monetary policy. And of course, we want to understand how the transmission channel changes. Second, at a more practical level, there's also an active debate going on about the implications of automation for monetary policy. For instance, one debate that is very old, that was already brought up by Keynes, is that automation can generate unemployment, technological unemployment. To the extent that central banks are concerned with unemployment, they should be concerned with automation. And even more directly, there's a debate going on in Japan if automation is deflationary. So you can think that automation allows firms to escape high labor costs, or it's making them more productive. That allows these firms to keep their prices low, and that may contribute to the deflationary drift. But despite the importance of these questions, there's very little academic research on this topic, connecting monetary policy and automation. And we believe the reason for that is that there is currently no simple framework connecting monetary policy and automation. And the goal of this paper is really to provide such a framework. So what we end up doing is quite simple. We take the standard model of automation, which is Acemoglu-Restrepo 2018 in the AER. And for those of you who have read the paper, it's quite a beast. So we strip the model to the bone, we simplify it, and to only keep the main mechanism in the model. And what's this main mechanism? Well, the idea is that capital and labor are highly substitutable, in fact, perfect substitutes in performing some production tasks. And macroeconomic conditions affect firms' adoption of automation technologies. So it's endogenous if firms choose to automate their production or not. And to this framework, we add two features that are commonly added in monetary economics. So first of all, we add nominal wage rigidities, which implies that monetary policy has real effects and that there can be involuntary unemployment. And the second is that we also add wealth and utility to get a long-run IS curve. So the main motivation for that is that this allows us to study a state where the economy is permanently stuck at the zero lower bound. Right, so the real interest rate can be permanently not equal to households' discount factor without the economy exploding to minus infinity. And so that's so we can speak to Japan basically with that. And it comes in handy also for other reasons, but I would be more precise on that in a second. So preview of results. So first on the transmission channel of monetary policy, how does it change? Here there's something that we call the automation effect of a monetary policy. And that's the idea that monetary easings or a cut in the interest rate can lead to more adoption of automation technologies because central banks affect the cost of capital of firms. So if a cut in interest rates reduces the cost of capital, then that may lead to more automation. So what are the effects of that? So the traditional view is that monetary easings raise employment and inflation. Right? The idea being that a cut in interest rates generates a rise in aggregate demand. Firms respond to that by hiring more labor, and as a result, there's also a pressure for prices to increase. Now, in our framework, monetary easings may have very different effect. Monetary easings may raise automation and productivity, even permanently, as you will see, while having little effects on employment and inflation. So what's the intuition? So again, the central bank cuts interest rates, so aggregate demand increases. But then the cut in interest rate at the same time incentivizes firms to invest more in automation, to adopt automation technologies. But this goes against the boom in the labor market, right? Because the investment is in terms of labor-saving technology. So the investment boom goes against the employment boom in the labor markets. So you can see how a cut in the interest rate may now have very little effects on employment, while at the same time increasing investment. Now, what about the effects on inflation? Well, if there's less of a boom in the labor market, there's also less pressure for wages to increase. So there's less wage inflation, and as a result, less inflation. And also the fact that productivity rises when there's more investment, that also goes against the boom in inflation. So you can see that in such a framework, the transmission channel can be very different. Monetary easings can lead to more productivity while having at the same time small effects on employment and inflation. So that's on the transmission channel. Now on the policy debates, by the way, we have more than Japan in the paper. So here I'm just putting one policy debate, but we have more in the paper. So we showed that indeed a wave of automation can push the economy to the zero lower bound and lead to a deflationary drift and unemployment. And one maybe surprising insight is that in such a framework, the response to get out of this situation can be to raise interest rates. Right? And the intuition is that by raising interest rates, making the cost of capital higher, the pace of automation can be reduced. And that that effect can be in principle so strong that labor is soaked back into the labor market. And so the central bank can restore full employment and avoid the deflationary drift by raising interest rates. Okay.
If I reduce investment, gross capital formation in the economy by 50% today, I will have a more inflationary economy tomorrow.
No, but typically investment is labor augmenting. So when you curb investment, you will trigger even less demand for labor. So that's what usually happens.
That any positive supply shock is deflationary.
So there will be a bit of the effect that you say. So maybe it will become clear in the model. So you will see that there is some of this effect in the model. Yes.
So the idea that you want to reduce automation to
yeah.
Is it an indication of the restricted set of instruments that you have if you had other?
Yes. Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah. So if we had fiscal policy which could just boost investment, that's it. You could also do that. That's right. So here we are only talking about monetary policy. Yeah. So here this is basically exploiting the substitutability between investment and employment. So by reducing one, you can lift the other. But of course, if you have two instruments, you can just lift both at the same time. So you can keep investment high while avoiding unemployment. That's perfectly right. Okay. So the related literature. So we built on this literature that models of automation, especially at Temuglo and Restrepo. Then there's a lot of work on the labor market implications of automation and inequality. So in our model there, we will not have any inequality, so we will have a representative agent. And then there's also some work on the policy implications, but this literature is mainly concerned with dampening the labor market effects of automation, so providing insurance to households, taxing robots, and so on. So here we will have a different view on policy. We will talk about monetary policy. Good. So that's the outline of the talk. I will show you the model. Then we will talk about the transmission channel, the automation effect of monetary policy, and then we will come back to the policy debates. Okay, so the model is really simple. So we have households that consume and save in nominal bonds and capitals. So the first order condition for saving for the bonds is the Euler equation. So the marginal utility today and the marginal utility in the future and the real interest rate. And then we have an additional benefit of saving, that's the xi, and that is capturing this wealth and utility function. Okay, so there's an additional benefit of saving, and you will see in a second why that is a very useful thing to have. And then there's a no arbitrage condition between bonds and capital, which is simply that the real interest rate is tied to the cost of capital. The second decision to make by households is labor supply, and here we make it again very simple. We assume that households want to work L bar, so you can think of this as full employment, so the flexible wage outcome. If they end up working less than L bar because of wage rigidities that I describe later on, we call this involuntary unemployment, and if they work more than L bar, it's overheating. Okay, very simple. Now the interesting thing happens on the firm side. So production takes place by these final good firms, and they produce using a continuum of inputs or tasks. So YT is the final good, and it's a combination of these intermediate inputs, which is YJT. Now, there are 3 different types of intermediate inputs. So there are some intermediate or some tasks that can only be produced with capital. So that's the low index J. Okay, so the production function for them looks like this. So they can only be produced with capital. So you can think of these tasks as being the very capital intensive ones, like pressing steel. That's something humans cannot do. So you need a machine to do that. Okay, so that's the low index tasks. Then there are some tasks in the middle where firms can choose between producing with capital or with labor. So those are the automatable tasks. So this is the action is going to be in these tasks. So you can see here there's a perfect substitutability between labor and capital for these tasks. And then there are tasks, so that's the high index task above JH, that they can be produced using only labor. Okay, so maybe that's tasks where labor has a very strong comparative advantage. Maybe walking your dog in the car, maybe that's something that robots cannot do. Or maybe that could be tasks that are not yet automatable. So maybe they will be in the future, but not as of now. Now, the nice thing about the structure is that the economy adds up to a Cobb-Douglas production function. So you can aggregate this to this production function. So YT is produced from capital and labor, and J star is now the cutoff for intermediate for these tasks, such that for all J below J star, the tasks are produced with capital and the rest is produced with labor. Okay.
That's because of the log additive.
Yeah. Yes. So what does it look like? So these intermediate, that I didn't say. So these intermediate good firms, they produce under perfect competition. And so in particular, those firms, when you look at those firms, when they decide whether to produce with capital or with labor, they will just compare the marginal cost. What's the marginal cost of producing with capital? It's RK divided by gamma. Okay, the cost of capital divided by this efficiency, and the marginal cost of producing with labor is the real wage divided by the efficiency of labor. So if the cost of capital is higher than the wage, then these firms in the middle, they will choose to produce with labor, because labor is relatively cheaper than capital. In this case, the J star is JL. Okay, so the only firms producing with capital are those that need to produce with capital. Okay, so only the low index firms. If, in contrast, the wage is very high, then for those firms in the middle, it is optimal to automate their production because wages are so high. And then the J star is equal to the JH. So basically, all the firms producing with capital are those that have to produce with capital and those that may want to, right? The automatable. It's only the high index tasks that are then left to produce with labor. And if the two factor prices happen to be the same, then firms are indifferent, the firms in the middle. Okay, so this model captures this notion that the low cost of capital relative to the wage implies that the automation is higher. Okay, so due to this Cobb-Douglas structure, factor shares satisfy the usual conditions. And as you can see, the J star, so the effect of this J star is that it raises the capital share at the expense of the labor share, right? So that's one feature of automation. So if J star is going up, the capital share increases and the labor share is going down. Now, if you insert this in the production function, you also get this condition, so the ideal price condition, okay, that the factor prices have to satisfy this equation. So let me close the model. So we just add a wage Phillips curve, okay, very, very simple. we assume that wage inflation is increasing in the heat in the labor market. So LT divided by the full employment level of L, and the slope of the Phillips curve is psi. Then the price of the final good is just given by this equation. So it depends on the cost of capital and depends on the wage. And finally, what's the choice of the central bank? Well, the central bank, of course, sets the nominal interest rate, and then this passes through to the real interest rate because of wage stickiness. And as a result, the central bank controls aggregate demand. So aggregate demand being consumption demand and investment demand. Okay, so that's the model. As you can see, it's very simple, and it will become now even simpler because we will start by studying the model in the steady state. So the steady state in this model is very tractable, and all the insights of the automation effect of monetary policy can be conveyed in the steady state, which is very nice because we can use a graphical analysis to get the effects. And then later on, we will also look at the transitions. Okay, so the first thing we do is that we combine one, so that was this ideal price condition, with the indifference condition for firms. So that's the condition where firms are indifferent between automating their production and not automating their production. So when you combine these two equations, then you can see that if the cost of capital is equal to the gamma k, then firms are indifferent between automating and not automating their production. So there's a critical cutoff for the cost of capital, such that if the cost of capital is higher than that, firms do not want to automate. If it's lower, they want to automate. But then in steady state, the interest rate, so that's so households being indifferent between saving and bonds and capital, that means that the real interest rate that is set by the central bank passes through to the cost of capital. Okay, so combining this and this, you see that for the central bank, there's now a cutoff, and the cutoff is gamma k minus delta, such that if monetary policy is tighter than this cutoff, then there will be low automation. If the real interest rate is below the cutoff, then firms will choose to automate big time. Okay, so a drop in the real interest rate induced by the central bank may generate a switch from low to high automation, and that's what we call this automation effect of monetary policy.
Why in steady state, when presumably the nominal interest is washed out, why?
Yeah, we will come to that. Yeah, in the next slide. Yeah. So, okay. So let's now look at basically the economy when the central bank moves from a high to a low interest rate. So how does the economy adjust? Okay. So first we want to understand what is the effect of monetary policy on aggregate demand. So what is aggregate demand? Aggregate demand is consumption demand and investment demand. Okay. So consumption demand, so the C, I can just evaluate, so the Euler equation, where is it? So that's the Euler equation in the steady state. Okay, that gives me an equation for consumption demand that only depends on the real interest rate. Okay, so that's consumption demand, and it's decreasing in the real interest rate. So a higher real interest rate means there is less demand for consumption. So the nice thing about this psi is that without the psi, this would just explode to minus infinity if the central bank has the real interest rate above households' discount factor. Okay, so the psi, what it does, the intuition that we have about the short run, about the effects of monetary policy on consumption demand, it also transmits to the long run. So this is what we call this long run AS curve. A negative relationship between investment, between consumption demand and the real interest rate, even in the long term. Okay, so this is consumption demand and this is investment demand. So this is the first order condition of the firms for investment. And what you can see is that investment demand is decreasing in the real interest rate. Right, that's a standard channel that we always have. Cost of capital goes up. But then there's also an additional effect, and that is the J star. And the J star is that when the central bank, when the real interest rate is cut by enough and the real interest rate passes above our bar, then there's an additional demand boost due to higher investment because firms now want to automate their production, and that generates a boost of investment. Okay. So let's look at this graphically. So here we have the real interest rate. Here there's our bar. So the central bank cuts the interest rate, that increases aggregate demand. And at this threshold, there's an additional boost because at this point, firms automate their production. Good. Now we ask the question, how do firms choose their capital and labor mix in order to satisfy this demand? So let's first look at capital. So firms' demand for capital can be written like this. So that's again coming from the first order condition of investment. Okay, so the capital demand is dictated by automation, capital deepening, and aggregate demand. Okay, so first of all, aggregate demand. So of course, if there's more aggregate demand, firms have to produce more, then they will respond by using more capital. Okay, then there's the capital deepening effect. So that means when the cost of capital is lower, then firms will use more capital. But this is at the intensive margin. So this is for those firms that are producing with capital. If the real interest rate is cut, then they will produce even more, so they will get more capital. Okay, they will produce more intensively with capital. So that's at the intensive margin. The new effect in our framework is the extensive margin, that it can be the case that the capital demand is also increased because there's now the use of capital is expanding to other tasks. Okay, so all three effects imply that when the interest rate is cut, there will be more demand for capital. Okay, again, because when the interest rate is cut, aggregate demand goes up. That's what we have already seen. Capital deepening points to more demand for capital, and automation also, and that will be again discrete at the point R bar. Okay, so capital demand. The capital demand curve looks like this. Cutting the interest rate increases capital demand in this way. So finally, let's look at labor demand. So that's the second component. So labor demand, so that's the first order condition for labor. It can be written like this. So again, there's a scale effect because of aggregate demand. Okay, so when aggregate demand goes up, firms will want more labor. And then there are two offsetting effects. So there's this, again, capital deepening and automation. So capital deepening, again, means that when the real interest rate goes up, then the firms tend to want less labor because because producing with capital becomes cheaper. But that's, again, the intensive margin. And that capital deepening effect is going against the aggregate demand effect, but normally we think that the total effect is still that the cut in the interest rate increases labor demand. Okay, the capital deepening effect is not strong enough to offset the aggregate demand effect. But here we have an additional effect, and that is the automation effect. Okay, so when the real interest rate passes above the threshold, firms automate their production, and then there's a discrete drop in labor demand. And that effect is very strong. And that can basically move against the other two effects. So graphically, it looks like this. So the real interest rate is cut, labor demand goes up. But then at this point where the central bank passes above the threshold, then there's a discrete drop in labor demand. And then below the threshold, firms have automated their production. And so further cuts in the interest rate will only tend to increase labor demand. All right, now let's put this together, capital and labor demand. So you can see that the standard model is above the threshold and below the threshold. The cut in the interest rate increases both labor demand and capital demand. So both move in the same direction. So the two are complements. Okay, so that's what we normally have in our models. The new thing in our model is that there is a range of the interest rate where the central bank triggers the automation effect of monetary policy. And in this range, capital and labor move as substitutes. So capital increases, but labor falls. Yes? No, so if you make this range small, so if the JL is the same as JH, then this will disappear and it will just become two downward sloping lines. No. So this is just to illustrate. But yes, we need this range, and basically the size of this will depend. So how big is the horizontal part depends exactly on how big is the distance between JL and JH. That's right.
Can I ask why the line is horizontal? Because presumably as the blue line more moves to the left, labor demand falls and wages fall.
At this point, wages don't fall. So what happens basically is that so firms automate their production. That tends to reduce the wage, right? Because the labor share is going down. But at the same time, there's also more capital, right? Because we're talking about steady state. So the capital stock rises also discretely at this point, and that pushes up the wage. So it turns out that at the threshold, so the wage, I don't show the wage curve, but the wage moves continuously. So when I move from up to bottom, so the wage tends to, so the lower the interest rate, the higher the wage. Okay. So a lower interest rate means a higher wage. That's how the wage moves over this range. Yeah, the capital stock, because we're talking about steady states. So the capital stock here adjusts. Yes, so but these are basically different steady states, exactly. All right. So let me summarize what we have seen so far. So monetary easing raises aggregate demand, but it may also incentivize firms to automate their production. And when this happens, labor productivity, output, the capital stock rise, but labor demand can decline. Okay, now let's close the model. Now let's look at what is the equilibrium steady state. Okay, so of course, all these steady states are not necessarily in equilibrium. So the way to close the model is to add labor supply to the labor demand curve. So this closing the labor market. Mm-hmm.
That's my problem, sure. But does your model imply that the steady state real interest rate can be affected by the macroeconomic?
Yes. Yes, I will talk to this. Yes, on the next slide you will see. Yes. So if labor supply is this, then there's only one steady state real interest rate. So here there's only one natural interest rate. Okay, so it can be the case that the labor demand curve has this position and the labor supply has this position. So in that case, all the automation action would be here when interest rates are above the steady state. So here there would not be different long run steady state real interest rates. But it can also be, and that's the interesting case, it can also be that it looks like this, that the labor demand curve intersects with the full employment curve twice. So now this is a model with very strong hysteresis effects, and the hysteresis effect are even on the real interest rate, exactly like you said. So that's a real interest rate that is compatible with full employment in the long run, but that's another one, and that's another one. And the intuition is that if here that's a steady state where the real interest rate is high, so aggregate demand is low, but at the same time there's very little automation because the cost of capital is high, right? And so that's compatible with full employment. And here the real interest rate is low, so aggregate demand is very high, so it's a big economy. So you would think that would lead to a more than full employment labor demand. But no, that's not the case because there's also a high automation, and that goes against. Yes.
It's a real growth model with a strong nonlinearity associated.
Well, outside of the steady states, the wage rigidity binds. So outside of here, it's a monetary model, but in steady state, yes, the wage rigidities are not binding. So you will get the same 3 steady states if this was a completely real model. That's correct, right? Okay, so MP stands for monetary policy and LD is labor demand. Sorry, so monetary policy tries to maintain the economy at full employment. That's why we called it monetary policy. Okay, so this model, this automation implies the possibility of very strong nonlinearities, and they can be even so strong as to generate hysteresis effects, or even long-run effects. So that's the point that we make. Now, you may find this a bit extreme. That's the next point I want to make. So you may find this a bit extreme that the automation occurs at this point, right? That is because we assume all firms are identical. So the efficiency of capital and of labor, so the gamma K and the gamma L is the same across firms. You can think that this may differ across firms. So you can have some industries where the capital is relatively efficient, so gamma K is a bit higher compared to gamma L, in some industries where it's not the case, where it's a bit lower, right? So different industries. So if you do this is now the paper by Moll, Rachel, Restrepo in the Econometrica. So if you have different industries that differ in terms of their efficiency of labor and capital, then you will get something like this. Okay, so coming from above, the central bank cuts the interest rate, then the first industry that will automate its production is the one where it's relatively easy to automate production because labor is not very productive relative to capital. Okay, so the first industry is crowded in, then you cut the interest rate, you get conventional effects, then the second industry and so on. So you get a zigzag line if you think of industries being different in terms of efficiency of labor and capital. Okay, this is Acemoglu and Restrepo. So their formulation of this relative efficiency of labor is a smooth one, so they assume it's exponential. And in this case, so this is really taken straight from their AER paper. In this case, the labor demand curve looks like this. Okay, so we can still have these 3 steady states. So as you cut the interest rate, you crowd in more and more firms. So more and more firms will increase, will choose to automate their production. And that effect can be strong enough to bend backward the labor demand curve. And you can still get, again, these hysteresis effects. Okay, the next question is, when will monetary policy have these unconventional effects? So of course this is a bit provocative, right? But we are also saying that this is not always the case. So it's really, the model suggests that these effects are very much size and state dependent. So why size? Because only large enough interventions can push firms above tipping points. Okay, so small interventions will have perfectly conventional effects. And state dependent is because when automation adoption is already high, further easings will only increase employment and inflation. So if we are here at this point, so the real interest rate is already low, and so the automation is high. So if you cut further the interest rate, you shouldn't expect to boost productivity further because the automation potential of the economy is already exhausted. Okay, so you will just increase employment and as a result inflation. So you get perfectly conventional effects. Okay, and then it's also time dependent, and this brings me now to the transition, as we will see. So basically, the model predicts that, so if the central bank cuts the interest rate, the demand effect comes first. Okay, so households increase their demand, but the supply effect, basically the supply side adjusting because of more automation, more investment, that takes a bit of time to happen, right? Because capital takes time to be installed in the economy. So you can have, in the short run, you get the conventional effects, but in the medium to long run, you can get the unconventional ones, that the supply side effect kicks in and goes against the demand effect. Okay, so it can look like this if you have a monetary policy shock, so a rise in the real interest rate, a temporary one, then in the short run, you get the usual thing, you get a drop in employment and output. But in the medium run, you can even get a rise in employment, and that is because now you damage the supply side by raising the real interest rate. So firms will start to reduce investment. There will be less automated tasks, less labor productivity, and as a result, labor will be soaked back into the labor market. And so in the medium run, you can get an employment boom out of a monetary tightening. Okay, so these effects operate at different horizons. The same is true for inflation. So a rise in the interest rate can reduce inflation initially, but then in the medium run, inflation can even go up because the supply side of the economy is damaged so much by this reduction in investment. So you can get so-called catch-up bottle effects of inflation, that it's first going down and then going up.
This is not true with normal investment, ordinary investment?
It's a bit true, yes, because you also have this, you have the capital deepening effect, which is operating in the same way. But it's stronger with automation. Yeah, but you're right. So that's also getting back to your point. So you have this somehow with also with normal investment because of capital deepening, but it's not as strong. Okay, and this is an example of hysteresis. So that's an economy with multiple steady states. So the central bank can permanently raise the real interest rate. In the short run, it will trigger a recession, but in the long run, employment will recover, right? Because what this ends up doing is to reduce investment, and so firms will automate their production by less, and then so in the long run, this will soak back labor into the labor market. So a very strong tightening can be consistent with a decline in investment rather than a decline in employment, even permanently. So we get these. Output will be permanently lower because of a smaller capital stock.
That does not bother.
No, the central bank cares about inflation, so that's going back to trend. So
Yeah, but then.
Of course, we are not talking about welfare here.
Unemployment and inflation, you can, the work week at 12 hours.
So I'm not talking about welfare.
Lower by
I'm not saying this is optimal in any way.
inflation will be the same, and you will have full employment.
Yeah, we are just highlighting this possibility that the rise in the real interest rate can have these effects. It goes to investment more than to employment. That's all we say. But of course, it may be completely stupid to do that from a welfare perspective. But maybe you want to do the opposite. Maybe you want to cut the interest rate in order to boost the economy permanently, right? That's the opposite is of course also implied, is possible in the model.
I don't fully understand. So you have multiple steady states.
Yes. Well, the model has a unique equilibrium in the sense that unique equilibrium paths are unique. So there's not a multiplicity of this sort. It's only that you have multiple steady states. And the central bank can move the economy from one steady state to the other. by, for instance, doing this. Then the only equilibrium path compatible will be the one where households know, okay, we're going to the other steady state in the long run, and then the economy adjusts accordingly.
Output lower in the no automation steady state.
Yes, because the capital stock is lower. Yes, yes.
Is that, does that uniqueness of the
Maybe
it must be depending on the user.
No, I think it's the case also locally. So we study the uniqueness properties locally also around the steady states, and they're all determinate, except the middle one. The middle one is unstable, but those two are locally stable. So I think that the transitions are unique.
The paper by Krugman and called History versus Expectations discusses that most people were not born or in this room. He says it depends on adjustment costs. The adjustment costs are very high, then the economy is very sluggish, and there is total path dependence, so there is a unique equilibrium. But if adjustment costs are small, then expectations play a bigger role, and then there is a multiplicity of equilibria. But if you are very close to one of the steady states, then again you have unicity. But if you are close to the cutoff point in the middle, you have stable equilibrium, then you have multiplicity. Spiral.
We should give Martin 2 minutes to come.
Okay, that's good. I have 2 more slides, so 2 minutes is enough. So maybe first on the on some evidence. Okay, so some people complain that monetary policy probably is not that powerful to move investment, but of course there is evidence that monetary policy affects medium-term real interest rates, which are the ones that we think are relevant for investment. And then there is also evidence that monetary policy can induce persistent supply-side effects or hysteresis effects. And this evidence is mounting up, but of course there's not so much evidence on specifically monetary transmission accounting for labor replacing investment. So we think that this is something that should be done, like looking at investment, but distinguishing between different types of investment and how monetary policy has different effects on these different types of investment. Okay, so that would be something that would be useful to look at in the future. So as you may have noted, this is not an empirical paper. So here we're just putting up possibilities, and we hope that this will guide future empirical work. Okay, and now the last thing I want to say is this Japan. So one policy experiment that you can do with the paper is suppose that the scope for automation increases, so the parameter JH goes up. Okay, so that's how the intermediate, the range of tasks that can be automated it now increases for exogenous reasons. And what this is doing in the graph is it shifts the labor demand curve to the left for interest rates that are low enough to be in the region where automation matters. Okay, so here this portion of the labor demand curve is shifted to the left. So here labor demand will decline discretely because for low interest rates, firms that will use the additional automation possibilities and just automate. Okay, so labor demand will fall discretely. And as you can see, there's now the second steady state. So the steady state that is compatible with high automation may now be no longer reachable for the level for positive interest rates. Okay, so this steady state will move to here. So we can have a situation where a push in automation reduces labor demand so much that the central bank cannot cut the interest rate by enough to maintain the economy at full employment. So here there will be some unemployment, and as a result also a deflationary drift. And what the model says is that, well, if you don't like this steady state, then in principle one way to get out is to try to get to this steady state. Okay, so what happens from here to here is that, well, you increase interest rates and as a result you reduce the pace of automation, right, because of higher cost of capital, and that ends up soaking labor back into the labor markets. So you have a full employment restored and the deflationary drift avoided, but at the cost of having a smaller economy because you killed some of the investment in the way. Okay, so it's a possibility that the model suggests that may be a way to get out of a liquidity trap when these forces are strong. Okay, on that, let me conclude. So we provide we think a very simple model to connect monetary policy and automation to think through what are the effects possibly that automation can have. And what we show is that besides employment and inflation, monetary policy may also affect automation and productivity, so have very strong supply side effects. Yeah, so these effects work against the traditional employment inflation effects, generating very strong nonlinearities, possibly strong enough to get hysteresis. And this policy experiment, the rise in automation, can push the economy in a deflationary liquidity trap, and we may be able to escape by raising interest rates rather than cutting interest rates further. Okay, thanks. That's it.
Time for one question. I'll ask one question. So if these are actually robots or machines that you can't just undo. In your model, you can eat them.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Then going from the bad to the good steady state, you're trying to do that, but to Armageddon. Right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
The robots will keep producing, the workers will be out of work, and
that's a good point. So the way we think about this is that this is an economy that should be seen relative to some growth path. There's no growth in the model, but of course in the background you can think that there's growth. And then all of this will be relative to trend. So the decline in investment will be not in absolute terms, but it will be relative to trend. So say investment grows normally by 2% a year, so robot adoption increases by 2%. For 5 years you do it at 0%, and then that may get you to this steady state. Okay, so it's relative to a balanced growth path, even though we don't model it for simplicity. So that's how I think about it.
Okay, thank you. Let's go for coffee and come back finally at 11 o'clock.